Good morning. I'm Mark Carkenny, the Senior Manager for Government Initiatives with ACT-IAC, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on the future of contracting. Today's webinar will feature a panel of august senior leaders, so we hope you will join us for the duration of today's conversation. Just a couple of brief housekeeping notes before we begin. All of the boxes on your screen are resizable. Please feel free to manipulate those boxes to fit your preferences. I'd also like you to submit your questions using the Q&A box on your screen. Our moderator, Dave Wennergren, ACT-IAC CEO, will be using them to facilitate today's conversation. Finally, this presentation is being recorded and will be made available for review on demand in the coming days. With all that said, I'll turn it over to you, Dave. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Future of Contracting webinar, part of our series of Acquisition Excellence 2020 events. I'm Dave Wennergren, CEO of ACT-IAC, and I am just delighted today to be joined by three outstanding thought leaders engaged in federal contracting. And another example of ACT-IAC's commitment to partner with other thought leadership organizations in addressing the top topics facing government today. We do indeed live in a time of tremendous change, with the pace of technology dramatically changing the way we live, work, and play. And with the bulk of government services procured from the private sector, the pressure has never been greater on federal contracting to be more agile, resilient, and forward-leaning. And then when you add on the changes we're all facing in this new normal of a pandemic, post-pandemic world, there's an even stronger imperative for transformation. Not to mention still sorting through the outcome of a presidential election. If times of change are times of opportunity, then we sure do have a lot of opportunity right here in front of us. So let's get started without any further ado. Steve Maier is the president of Management Concepts. Welcome, Steve. Why don't you kick us off by telling us a little bit about Management Concepts and the Preparing for the Future of Contracting report that you undertook with NCMA, and any other introductory thoughts you'd like to offer?
All right. Well, thanks, Dave, and good morning, everyone. As Dave said, let me start with a little bit of background. I'm not going to talk so much about Management Concepts. But Management Concepts has been in the acquisition training business for 47 years. And in addition to that, we've been an education partner for NCMA for decades. We set out about a year and a half ago to start giving back to the community by providing some thought leadership in this career field. At the time, it's interesting, we were seeing the debate about the impact of technology on all workers worldwide and the amount of labor effort that would be freed. And frankly, the number of workers that would be displaced. And for me, that was a little bit disconcerting. It was clear that the government acquisition profession would not disappear, but needed to move to a more strategic and influential role. So we knew the time that technology released could be used to provide greater value, and we wanted to help articulate what that future might look like. At the same time, the government organizations had begun working on several relevant PMA capitals. Those included developing a workforce for the 21st century, shifting from low-value to high-value work, and frictionless acquisition, all of which seemed to gel around this conversation. What does the acquisition workforce look like in the future? So we started the paper at really collecting information and doing interviews at NCMA's World Congress in July of 2019, and took all of the information from that and subsequent interviews to put together the paper that we published, and that was published in December of 2019. It's interesting. Literally a month following the publication of the white paper, Dave, as you said, the world began fighting a COVID-19 pandemic. The rapid shutdown as a result accelerated moves by the private sector and the federal government to leverage technology and tools to streamline and innovate all parts of government. The paper covers many of the long-term actions needed, but I actually believe some of the things that were in there that may not have happened in this time frame have taken place just because of the unique time we're in. So I look forward to a great conversation this morning.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Melissa Starinsky is the president of the National Contract Management Association, NCMA. Thank you for joining us, Melissa. Why don't you give us some opening thoughts on NCMA's efforts and what you're seeing in the contracting market, and any additional comments you'd like to pile on about the report?
So thanks, Dave, and good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here with you this morning. As Dave said, the world has rapidly changed from where we were a year ago this same time. And I would say, we'll have a lot to say throughout the discussion here this morning, but relative to the report, I would say two things that I think have emerged as a result of COVID-19 that I think are worth noting. And the first one is how and where we work. Obviously, we all had to kind of pivot to this virtual environment, and that certainly is impacting the way we execute the contract management function. And then the second thing, and this was well underway before COVID-19, but I think it was amplified by COVID-19, is supply chain risk management. So that's going to certainly influence the what we buy, how we manage risk. But I also think there's a broader risk management piece to all of this and what we need out of the contract management function more broadly around risk management, not just in supply chain risk management. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation. I think there's a lot of interesting things that we're going to be able to talk about and share this morning. So thank you. Delighted to be here.
Excellent. Absolutely. We're going to come back in a couple of minutes to the where we work in this thriving in a virtual world model. I'm so delighted you brought up the risk management issue. Supply chain, of course, a crucial issue for all of us, but the broader issues about, being willing to manage and accept some risk rather than just try to avoid all risks is really having a profound impact on making the right choices for contracting approaches and stuff. And so I'd love to hear some more from you about that too. But before we get into the next set of questions, I'd like to introduce our third panelist, David Berteau, the President and CEO of the Professional Services Council, PSC. Welcome, David. It is always a pleasure catching up with you. I know you and PSC have been extremely active on this topic, so why don't you share with us some introductory thoughts on what you're focused on in the federal contracting market?
Thank you, Dave, and really appreciate the invitation to join you here today. Of course, the audience is vital to the success of all of this effort. Let me give a couple of opening thoughts. I want to endorse what both Steve and Melissa have said, but not repeat it. I think that we're at a situation where, we all recognize that we need to help the government be a smarter customer and a better buyer, right? And so, my membership are the contractors that provide support and help to the federal government. But we really need the government to have a clearer idea of what they need and what's available, and that's the smarter customer piece of it. And then, of course, the acquisition system, the procurement process is how do you actually go get that and get it delivered. And let me take a step back from that as a starting point and reflect a little bit on the dynamic we find ourselves in. We find ourselves in a situation where I think we all recognize that not all of America has all the trust in government that they should have. And we can spend a whole nother session on exploring that. But I think a key part to rebuilding and restoring that trust is, in fact, a government that performs better. And it's my belief, and I think our belief at PSC, that a big chunk of that performing better is better contracts and better performance under contracts. Contracts that focus on results and outcomes more than they focus on input. Companies that actually know what it is they're trying to achieve, and they can measure those results and outputs as well. And I think we've got a lot already underway that helps us get to that. It's a major objective. But it's not easy. And it's not easy because it's not automatic, and it's not something you do a mass modification and change all contracts and change that world. So I think that's something we'd like to explore a bit more this morning. How does a better use of contractors and a better results from contracts lead to better performance by the government and therefore a rebuilding and a restoration of the trust in government that America so desperately needs? So thank you, Dave.
Fabulous,
over to you,
David.
and let's move on.
All right, absolutely. So we've mentioned the report a couple of times now. The report is available to all of you watching the webcast. And then David brought up the issue of trust, which reminds me to just point out everybody that we, like all the organizations on this call, are writing a lot during this election season about the issues that will matter. Ours are called Agenda 2021, and the whole top line of our set of documents is around delivering outcomes and building trust. That those two sets of issues are just going to be crucial to the government moving forward. So I'm delighted to come back to some of those topics as we go through. But you've also touched on the way the world has changed. And so I wanted to just spend another couple of minutes on that topic and say, I was originally going to ask you about so what are the trends that you've seen over the last few years But then I almost feel like, then the world shifted. And so this amplifying effect of the pandemic over the last 8 months, what are some of the fundamental changes for federal contracting that you've seen coming into the pandemic and now as we try to progress our way through it and into the new normal that we will have coming out of it? And we'll let anybody jump in on this one.
Let me make a couple of opening points, and then we'll see whether Steve and Melissa agree with that. Melissa already touched on teleworking, and I think one of the dramatic changes is, there was very little confidence either in the federal government or, frankly, in a lot of institutions and organizations that teleworking really was just as good as working in the office, right? And that mentality was pervasive and longstanding. And in fact, the executive branch was moving, prior to March, away from teleworking, and then all of a sudden it's let's maximize teleworking. I think that's one thing that we've seen is, at least over the last 8 or 9 months, it not only works, it works well, right? And I think the nature of what that means going forward is really important. But I think there's a couple of other things we've seen as a result of the pandemic. One is that actually there's a lot more trust, I believe, between government and its contractors than was necessarily there before. It's not so much an us-them as we are actually partners. We're working together, and we had to do that. And I think we've seen a step in that direction, and I'd really appreciate Melissa and Steve's views on whether that summary from my point of view is accurate as well. The third thing I think we've seen is the real value in modernizing technology and moving away from legacy systems. And there's a number of cases we could cite here where the hit of the pandemic and the need to move to teleworking has accelerated that transition from legacy systems to modernized new systems. It's not only accelerated, it's made it more pervasive and more widespread. And I think we've seen very real benefits from that. And I can only hope that pressure continues and those good results continue to increase going forward. So those are the three things I would observe to start with.
Yeah. How about you, Melissa? You mentioned this in your opening remarks.
Yeah, no, I think we've done well. Certainly the way in which we engage with industry is changing, and I think we've done it quite well. I know in prep for the session that we're having here this morning, the four of us talked about, the ability to kind of sustain that. And so I think we've pivoted pretty well. We've done pretty well to continue. And in some cases, I actually would say that we've increased the engagement because of the ease with which we can set up virtual meetings. We no longer have restrictions on how many people can hop on, Zoom calls and so forth. And so I think it's become easier to exchange with industry. The one thing I would offer up, though, is I wonder how well that engagement, because we're missing out in that face-to-face in-person engagement. And so I wonder over time, are we going to see any adverse impacts if this becomes the future for us, right? That we're going to see a higher concentration of this virtual work. How do we strike the right balance to make sure that we continue creating those opportunities for industry and government to engage with one another so that government really can understand what are the capabilities that exist in the marketplace to solve some of the challenges we have. So I love the direction that we're heading in. I will tell you, I, for one, although I was supportive of telework, I was pleasantly surprised with how well the entire organization that I work for, that we pivoted to virtual, and productivity is actually up. I will tell you, some of the tools and the technologies that we're using makes it much easier to collaborate on documents and get documents moving along faster in the chain. And so pleasantly surprised. I think it's a little too soon to weigh in on, if we're in this mode for 5 years, will it be as effective then as it is today? And I think we just have to be careful and think through, how do we really create that space to ensure that engagement between government and industry is really effective?
Yeah, well, you and David have touched on the greater collaboration, which is just music to my ear, because, despite years of Mythbuster memos and better buying power memos and things, we still sometimes struggle enough about the collaboration thing. And I do think you're right. We have to, on the one hand, the virtual world has broken down a lot of barriers. You don't have to go traveling in TDY to go meet with people. You can just instantly connect. But we do run the risk over time, I think, of the Zoom fatigue issue. And how do we make sure that we keep that collaboration meaningful and going forward? And I think it also speaks to this issue of agility that perhaps we can come back to later, because, we had to turn on the dime, if you will, for a lot of contracts about where work was going to be performed. And so it speaks to that sort of resiliency issue about the need to continue to be more and more agile in how we put contracts into place.
Yeah, and if I could just offer one other thing kind of related to that, I think that part of my observation on why we pivoted so successfully is there were already some really well-established relationships. And I think, again, it ties to the sustainment piece that as we try to forge and establish new relationships, how do we do that effectively in a virtual way, versus the old-fashioned way, right, of those face-to-face meetings and networking when we're able to kind of come together and meet with people and have those kinds of conversations. So I think it's much easier when you have those relationships already established. It's going to be more challenging to build new relationships in a virtual, and that may just, maybe my old school thinking on that, but I'm a big believer in the power and the importance of relationships and trust, because I think at the end of the day, whether you're industry or government, we're all working toward a common goal to deliver to the American people.
Amen. Steve, how about you? Any thoughts you'd like to add this conversation around trends and the impact of the pandemic?
A couple. First, I agree 100% on the collaboration and the relationship thing. I think this is a pendulum that has basically swung the other direction, and that we will find a middle ground where people can still engage face-to-face, but a significant more of how we interact and collaborate will continue to use technology to do it. And so those two things together, I think we haven't found the best formula yet. I also want to do a shout out for all the IT organizations in the government that actually made all this possible in a very short period of time, and the acquisition people that actually got it done. In our business, for years and years and years, we've been training in classrooms all over the world because that's what our customers wanted. And we flipped from 90%, 95% classroom training and 5 to 10% virtual to 100% virtual in 90 days. And so we've done 3,400 classes and taught 57,000 students virtually in the last 5 months, probably 6 months. That's more than we've done in the last 10 years virtually. So it's an amazing shift. In our business, I actually don't think we will go back to as much classroom training as there was in the past. But again, back to the conversation we have, this could not have been possible. And while we were actually planning for this long term, in no way did we believe that this shift would happen in the time frame that took place this year. And again, that's all due to the acquisition and IT organizations that made it possible for us to continue to run our businesses, whether it's the business of government or in the private sector, very, very quickly. And I want to touch briefly on Dave's comment about trust. I agree. We have had more organizations reach out to us and engage with us for help and to engage in a dialogue around the things that we do to help them be more successful. That's a really positive change, and I hope that continues.
Yeah, absolutely. We all hope. We've all mentioned a little bit technology, and so I'd like to just stay on trends for another couple of minutes. One trend is certainly the pace of technology change, and to David's point, I'll foot stomp the importance of we don't just need to move to the cloud. We need to take care of all those legacy systems and rationalize our way through them. But it's sort of like a double whammy in the contracting business. It's both the contracting for technology in a different way, but also all the underlying systems for the contracting process that themselves having to move off of legacy systems. So I wonder if maybe we could talk a little bit more about the trends that you've been seeing in the contracting space, either about technology or if there's another trend that you've seen in the last couple of years that you think is important to highlight this morning.
I guess I'll go first. I think it's not just the technology, but it's the power of data. I've been in the acquisition business for over 30 years, and we've been complaining about the same issues for 30 years. And I think a lot of those complaints have been grounded in anecdotal, conversations and people's opinions on where the choke points and the pain points are within the process. And so I think there is a huge opportunity for us, especially those on the government side, to really start leveraging and harnessing data around the process of contracting. And I'll just use cycle time as an example, to really start gathering data around critical path milestones to understand where things are getting hung up, because I think we probably would all agree that, the cycle time, it's too long. And unless and until we can capture data that helps us understand the root causes of why it may take too long, we can't really move the dial on that. So I think the power of data in terms of operational performance and the contracting process itself, and there's tons of things beyond just cycle time, but then also the power of data to optimize agency spend and to get better value for every dollar that we invest in the organization. So I think there's a huge opportunity on the contracting side on the data piece. With respect to the technology piece, again, there's just the things that we've seen that have emerged in this space to enable the process to work more efficiently, more effectively, free up. I will tell you, I think my observation of the contracting workforce gets mired down in process and managing process as opposed to managing risk and the outcomes that we're looking for related to those acquisitions. And so if we can find a way to better leverage the technology and the tools to help manage that process, free up those contracting officers who certainly have the critical thinking skills to do higher level work, that will be a really good thing. And I just think that the data and the technology that's available to us today is unlike anything that we've ever seen in my whole entire career. And I think we need to take advantage of that.
Yeah, and before we move on to our other two panelists, a question came in from the audience that seems like spot on to this conversation that we're having about the power of data, and it was around, so with teleworking, are we seeing, or could we see production data from the teleworking work that might help us change our strategies about how we define place of performance in future contracts and or, even cost strategies, because doing this virtually is so much less expensive than having to go travel and be on site and stuff. And so do you have any thoughts about that, Melissa?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, folks need to be really thoughtful, right, around how you kind of capture that data. I will tell you anecdotally, I've seen significant productivity increases in terms of, again, because of the ability to collaborate real time. The old-fashioned way was you'd meet, you talk about something, you review documents, you'd give your suggestions, go back, rework the document, get it back in the queue. Lots of documents in the federal government have to go to very high levels of reviews and approvals. And this is per the FAR. Some agencies have imposed even more on top of what the FAR requires. But specifically for those things that the FAR requires higher levels of approval for, I think the technology has enabled the collaboration to work on those documents in real time when you're together. And it has accelerated the approval of those kinds of documents. And so I think the question will be, or the key will be, to start measuring how much more effective and productive we've been. And if we're able to kind of prove that out, that we've realized productivity gains as a result of that, I think that bolsters the business case for continuing with certainly some level of telework.
Yeah. Steve or David, do you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
You need the data. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, Steve or David, you want to jump in on this conversation around trends around technology or data or other trends we're seeing in the marketplace and how that's impacting the contracting world?
This is David. I'd like to put a little bit of apply the brakes a little bit to the enthusiasm, even my own enthusiasm that I voiced earlier. We have heard from a number of our members and a number of the government customers that they serve that this is still a temporary hiatus, that, we will get back to business as usual at some point. I'm inclined to agree with Melissa. I don't think we ever go back to where we were before, but let's not overlook the tendency of the agencies to think, we were doing what we should have been doing before. And I'll note a couple of data points on the way. If you look at the COVID spending, and each of the agencies, mostly HHS, DOD, et cetera, who have spent a lot of money under contracts as a result of the CARES Act, et cetera. And you look at the distribution of the contract vehicles that have been used there. In DOD, for instance, they're reporting about $16 billion of COVID-related contract obligations. Nearly half of those are using other transaction authority. They're outside of the FAR. If that is the future tendency, that's not necessarily a tendency that gives either the competitive access or the transparency and visibility of both solicitations, evaluations, and awards that we've become accustomed to in our business, right? And of course, that raises the question of if you can fix the time-related problems, and presumably that's part of why DOD was using OTA is because of the speed to contract. If you can fix the time-related problems for some, and particularly for some important things, then maybe we ought to have the question asked, why can't we fix it for everything? Because Melissa mentioned lead times, right? And both the DOD under one National Defense Authorization Act and the entire federal government under another one has an affirmative responsibility to both identify how to measure procurement administrative lead time, to actually collect the data on that, and to make it publicly available. And to this point, neither DOD nor the broader OFPP arena have complied with those statutes, so we still don't have that information available. So there's a lot of opportunities for improvement here, and maybe we can use the COVID-19 situation as an accelerator to those rather than a brake. Over.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Steve, you want to jump on the technology train, as it were? Technology and data impacts on the contracting world?
What I would say is we're just at the beginning. I think there's a whole lot more that there is to come. Technology that's available today to handle unstructured data or information that's in documents is accelerating really fast because it's not needed just in the government, but also the private sector. So when you talk about the contracting profession, and while RPA and AI and a lot of this is primarily dealing with structured data, the unstructured data part of this will accelerate all this process even more. When you look at the requirements around laws and regulations in the procurement process, that will be much better handled in the future with the technology, leaving it to the acquisition professional to actually guide the system through the process rather than actually being the machinery that makes the process work itself.
Yeah,
so I think there's a lot more coming.
Yeah.
Hey, Dave.
You ain't seen nothing yet, as they say. Yes, Melissa.
Yeah, can I respond to something Dave said about OTAs? And sure. I think he's spot on that I think OTAs emerged in significant part because of the cycle time issue, right? And I think, we need to be careful about that. And I agree with you completely around the transparency issue related to that and the fairness. And, we want to do what's best for the American people and have good competition and so forth. But I think, I'll go back to some of the earlier comments about, the trust and making sure that on the government side that requirements are defined well, what are the outcomes that we're looking for. And I'll steal one of my colleagues, Greg Giddens, when he was at the VA. One of the guiding principles that he put out to the acquisition workforce was good requirements make for good contracts, right? And so I worry that the OTA authorities that are being exercised, that we're seeing them, and I think there's a place for them certainly, but I think we need to make sure that we're still, focused on getting the qualitative aspects and the outcomes that we're seeking. And so while they may be faster, to get, to someone, we run the risk of still not addressing the real problems that we're trying to solve or the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And so I do think that we need to continue working as an integrated acquisition team to better manage demand on the government side, to really articulate what are those outcomes that we're looking for, with our industry partners. And so, again, OTAs have emerged. I think they have a place, but I think we need to be careful about their use.
Amy, can I foot stomp on that a little bit? Because I think that with respect to technology, and all of us are old enough that we remember the day when the federal government was the leader of investing in new technology, right? Whether it was for national security or for citizen services, we were driving the marketplace. That's not true anymore, right? Now the federal government is actually trails where the commercial sector is going in terms of new technology and new developments. And their cycle time for developing something new is way less than our cycle time for putting money in the budget, getting it appropriated, getting an RFP out, getting solicitations, evaluations, awards, and then performing. And so, we haven't kept pace with either the source of that technology or the developments in the application of that technology. That's a huge challenge. OTAs is obviously one way to bypass that challenge, but we need to figure out how to bypass that for everything. And to recognize that, you look at a lot of the cloud contracts, for instance, they tend to almost start to look like, I don't know what you're going to have in 2 years, but I want to buy some of it. Right? Well, that's hard to write as a requirement. It's hard to evaluate proposals based on that. It's even hard to award and perform. So I think we have an enormous challenge, and actually I look forward to working with everybody on this panel and all you represent to help overcome that challenge, because our cycle times have got to catch up with the cycle times of the technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like there's almost no going back. I heard you said there's another question from the audience around the more virtual we go, the more we risk our sensitive data being exposed to, and all the protections we take in an in-person world to protect source selection sensitive information and stuff. But I feel like, that barn door's been open and we're not going back. So we're going to have to be really super adept at finding more technology and better cybersecurity solutions that allow us to operate in this virtual world. I'm going to ask for a lightning round now. Because, in Washington, D.C., we complain a lot about the problems, but I'm a hopeless optimist. And so I would love to just spend a couple of minutes talking about successes. So I'm going to ask each of you to offer up one success that you're seeing in the federal contracting market that we should share with the audience. And it can be an initiative, a general direction we're heading in, a specific agency. I mean, it can be any type of positive success story, but I'd love to get one success story from each of our thought leaders here that they're seeing in the federal contracting market, so we continue our audience having hope about the future. Who'd like to go first?
One of the hard things in our world is we don't talk about successes very often, right? And part of the reason we don't talk about successes, all of us have been in positions where if you brag about how well you're doing, the IG shows up, GAO shows up. They want to know, what you're covering up to do that. The comptroller shows up and says, well, clearly we're giving you too much money. We need to take some of your money away and give it to somebody who's failing more than you are. We've all been through that, right? The incentive structure is not great in that regard. But if you do as I do and you watch the SAMI Awards, right, and you look at all of those great programs that are being celebrated with awards to government career people who are doing so well, in the time when you had these in person as opposed to this past year where it was all virtual, there's actually some contractor support behind that creates that success story, but we don't talk about that very often. In fact, if you're at the SAMI Awards, you get to figure out who the supporting contractor was, because that's the table that applauds when their guy goes up, right? And so that dynamic, it's there, you just don't talk about it much. I think more than success stories, individual success stories, David, we need a better process for both identifying and promulgating and making people aware of those success stories, both internally because we learn from one another. If this guy's doing it well, how can I piggyback on that? And externally. And I would encourage ACT-IAC to be a purveyor, a collector and a purveyor of those success stories going forward. It may be the most important thing that we can do coming out of this discussion this morning.
Well, I appreciate that plug, and I will say it is a fun, top priority effort for us identifying some of these success stories. Because you're right, it's often easier to keep your head down and stay out of the line of fire. David did mention the Service to America Awards, the Partnership for Public Service puts on every year, which are just an incredible set of array of like celebrating amazing successes in the federal workforce. But you're right, we don't do enough of it, and we definitely need to be celebrating our successes because otherwise people feel like they're on their own. And it's harder to blaze that trail when you're not going there with anybody else. How about Steve or Melissa? Is there a success that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I can't think of any one specific one that is directly related. I will say that there are some people, senior acquisition folks in the government, that did take this white paper, paid very close attention to it, and started applying it in their organizations, even to the degree of restructuring their organizations. What I can't tell you, because I don't know, is what progress they've made and how much success they've had. But I do know people are paying attention to this in the acquisition space and are looking to try and evolve their workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for the purposes of today, keeping it general is fine, but I mean, I think we're seeing advances in customer experience, category management. Some of these efforts are bearing fruit. Melissa, did you want to add anything on the success?
Actually, I was going to mention category management. I think category management is here to stay. It's been evolving under multiple administrations, and so I think it is here to stay, and I'm seeing some evidence and successes, at least at the initial awards, and I'll just point to HHS's award under the EIS contract, this was the replacement to network, so all of the underlying telecom infrastructure for agencies, and so HHS came together to do that as an enterprise-wide buy, which in part is consistent with category management principles, and so at the basic award, it is promising that it's going to yield the entire department significant cost savings downstream, and hopefully we'll see better demand management on the government side, and so I think we're going to see more and more of that. And that's where the power of data comes in, having visibility into where those opportunities are to really employ category management principles to those kinds of programs. And then the other thing I will just say, I think the federal government has done a pretty good job of balancing all of the competing, demands that they have in the contracting process, and specifically to the small business community. I think, the contracting workforce is trying to execute against the mission, but also meeting the fulfillment of these other public policy objectives like small businesses. And so I think I think the federal government has done a good job, and I think our small business partners, for the most part, have delivered on those mission requirements. And so I think we collectively as a community, whether you're government or industry, I think we've done a good job of balancing all of those competing requirements in support of successful mission execution.
Dave Wennergren, I do have one success story, and it's a process success rather than program success, right? So it is back to the teleworking, right? When we got to March and we realized, okay, we're going to have to telework. And Melissa, you probably saw this in spades, right? So it's easy to issue an order from OPM and have it flow down through the federal career civilian workforce. But when you get to contractors, and we saw this in spades, right? The first thing that pops up is the administrative contracting officer says, teleworking is not authorized under your contract. Well, and so how do we get to a point where we make it blanket authorization rapidly? You don't want to undermine the warrant of the contracting officer. You don't want to undermine the power of that relationship and the importance of that relationship and those functions. But at the same time, you want to say there are higher order issues here that we need to bring into bear. And what I would say is a very, very excellent process shift, a real success story, both in the memo, I think it was March 20th, that came out of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy that says to contracting officers everywhere, do everything you can to maximize teleworking as rapidly as possible. And then within the agencies, essentially, what had the effect of mass modifications that made that possible almost from the get-go. That was a process success story that, only those of us on the inside will look at and say, wow, that was really hard and really well done. And I think that's the kind of thing it has been repeated over and over again where, class deviations have been used rather than following all the lengthy time of the Administrative Procedures Act. I don't know that that's a long-term solution, but when you can pivot like that, and pivot was the word I think, Melissa, you used, and it was a real pivot, not a pirouette, but a real pivot. And I think being able to tell the difference between doing that and when it's important, but not doing it for everything, because you still do need comments periods for things, is a really important success story that we ought to not overlook.
Thank you, David. I think that's a great story. But let's shift the topic for a moment to innovation. So, I'll stipulate up front that it's both a hot topic and a buzzword today. Everybody wants more innovation. And as David knows, I've often opined that, there are lots of people that can offer innovative solutions, from Silicon Valley startups to longtime contractors in the marketplace, and we often sometimes are far more hampered by how we ask for things than by who we ask. And so I'd love to get your sense, and we'll start with David and work our way around, about what's some advice that you can offer and how we can, take some specific steps to collectively encourage more innovation in both how we contract and also what we contract for. I know it's a subject that you've written and talked a lot about, David. Do you want to start?
Yeah, so two things, David. One, of course, is I don't think you can do innovation top down. I think, issuing orders says innovate more is not going to produce anything at all. I think what we need is a system that has the users at the point where they're interacting, whether it's the Defense Department and they're buying for themselves, or whether it's the VA and they're supporting the veterans and their customers all around the world. And so innovation has got to have a path from the bottom up. But I think there's another dynamic to it that's really important here, and I see this beginning to permeate the acquisition system. A lot of things that we used to buy as a product, we can now buy as a service, right? And that does require a shift in terms of focusing, because the real value of innovation is getting to better outcomes faster and cheaper and more effectively, right? Not having a glitzy process that you brag about, right? And I think the more we shift to focusing on procuring services with defined outcomes and results, the more we'll be able to take advantage of the innovation that's going out there. Over?
I think that's a powerful point. We're certainly seeing the commercial world more and more managed service solutions, where in the past we would have bought an IT system and paid for staff augmentation and things like that. And instead, through statements of objectives process, we come up with a performance-based contract around an outcome and allow the company to use their ingenuity to figure out a way forward. And you also mentioned something earlier, David, that I think it needs to be foot-stomped in this part of the conversation. And, we do have these pockets of innovation. We have the Defense Innovation Unit, the Procurement Innovation Lab at DHS, and people are finding innovative ways. But you emphasized earlier about how important it is that once we find a streamlined new way of doing things, that we have to make it available to everybody, not just keep it in these pockets of these innovation centers. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Melissa, how about you want to jump in on the innovation conversation?
You touched on it. I think, like I said before, I've been in this business for over 30 years, and I still think we have an opportunity to adopt performance-based acquisition principles, more wholesomely. And I think, there's been some successes over the years, but I think there remains opportunity to really define what are the problems we're trying to solve, the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and be open to innovative solutions coming in from the private sector versus dictating and prescribing how we want the contractor to meet the government's needs. So I think, I've continued to kind of push for performance-based acquisition, and it makes the requirement side of the house so much easier, right? I think the government spends so much time trying to figure out how to solve the problem when we should be relying on the private sector to help do that. I would, relative to the concept of innovation within the process of contracting, and this is where I think the risk management piece comes in, is that I think we just need to better manage the risk within the process. And there's a policy piece to this too. Government policy organizations that may impose policy to insulate from all risk, right? And so I think we have to shift, and the FAR guiding principles even talk about this, that the goal of the system is not to avoid all risk, but it's to manage the risk. And that's a mindset shift. And I think we try to set policy sometimes to avoid all risk. And I think there's an opportunity for us to really look at that and understand, like, why are we making these choices in the process that we use to do the contracting function, manage that risk. And tied to that then is there needs to be leadership top cover and deliberate decisions around, acquisition policy risks, to say, we understand that may create some vulnerability here, but the cost of avoiding all risk here, outweighs the benefits that we're going to get from that. And so I encourage, particularly on the government side, to really be looking at those things and deliberately making choices around some of the policies that may have been imposed, and perhaps relaxing some of those to enable more efficiency, more effectiveness, better mission outcomes. So I think there's that. And so I think I've talked about both. Like, I think we need to find better ways to pull in more innovation from the private sector. And then I think we can apply innovation and risk management to the process that we use to contract in support of the mission.
Thank you. So your words on risk are music to my ear. We're going to come back to that in a couple more minutes when we talk about the workforce. But I also am struck by, this idea that the outcomes, Fortune 100 companies don't usually build their own payroll system. They go to a world-class provider of payroll services and let that person do it. And they don't nitpick the specific requirements about the system. They take a commercial off-the-shelf solution and they use it, and align their business practices. And we talked a lot about that at our Shared Services Summit a few weeks ago. There's still a lot of work to be done there, but a lot of opportunity. But before we get off the topic of innovation, Steve, I know you have been a champion for innovative solutions for quite a while now, and I'd like to let you get in on the innovation conversation.
Absolutely. So let me pick up with where Melissa left off. All of that's really good, and what I want to bring everybody back to is, in order for this to work, in order for the government to actually go down a procurement path and to be able to understand the risk and to actually work with the industry or private sector to be successful, requires more dialogue. And I know there's a lot more conversation around having the government engage with industry much more frequently, much earlier in the process, so that people can understand the nature of the challenge and prepare for procurement, rather than having something drop all of a sudden, here it is, try and figure out what the government really wants, because I go into a lockdown mode and I can't talk to people. So I believe there's some criticality in that engagement, in changing the nature of that engagement so that it is much more collaborative inside and outside of government. The other is there does need to be a culture shift inside government towards more risk tolerance. Risk in the private sector is looked at in the context of its magnitude and how effective my mitigation measures may be. Certainly, catastrophic risks are not acceptable, but small risks are, and private sector takes small risks every day relative to the overall size of the project or program they're working on. That mindset could be shifted into the government as well. I get it. I hear, Dave's brought this up in the past. We only talk about failures And every risk we take that doesn't turn out the way we thought results in a failure and people get stressed about it. We have to learn to accept that. So again, I think organizations are beginning to be curious about innovation. I think with DHS's Procurement Innovation Lab, looking at our flexibilities, doing all of these other things, I think there's a lot of opportunity to do more. I think we just have to encourage and support people trying to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've got about another 10 minutes or so. And before we get to our final question, I would like to sort of dig in on the workforce for just a moment, since it's come up a couple of times. Melissa talked about the need for a mindset shift on risk. Steve talked about the power of collaboration and the importance of cultural change. So I wonder if you could offer some advice about how we will successfully recruit and retain the contracting workforce of the future, and the fact that how changing that workforce will be and the needs and skills of that workforce.
So I'll go first, and I would just say that, again, I fell into this career field by accident, more than 30 years ago. It wasn't something that, I even knew of as I, entered my college career. And so I am still so incredibly thankful and grateful that I fell into this career field, and I think it remains an incredibly lucrative career field, as well as, provides people an opportunity to really have a high impact for the services that we deliver to the American people. And so I've observed that I think, we pull really great, talented people into this profession. I think we have an opportunity to continue providing data and tools to help them do their jobs better. If we can find ways to free them up from having to manage the process, right? And the same thing I think applies on the industry side. I think, industry is conforming to the process that the government is imposing. If we can leverage the data and the tools to enable a more efficient, more effective process, then I think we start getting to the more higher impact outcomes that we're all collectively striving towards. So I really believe that we're at a point in time. I've never felt more optimistic about this profession than I do right now, because I think the data and the technological tools that are available can truly be a game changer to free up both on the government and the industry side to focus less on the process and more on the outcomes that we're striving to achieve. So I think, we have a great talent pool. We have the ability to hire in really, really smart people. It's up to us to give them the data and the tools to enable a better process for them to work within.
Fabulous. Steve, David?
Let me make two comments or maybe three on the workforce, and I want to build on some of what Melissa talked about. So we've had very successful transition to remote workforce, right? But there's an awful lot of jobs that cannot be done remotely. Touch labor jobs, access to classified systems. We're never going to get to the point where everything can be done. I went in for a blood test, and I said, you're not going to put that needle in my arm from 6 feet away, right? No, I'm actually going to have to come up next to you in order to do that. So there's a lot of lab work, et cetera. So I think we have to recognize that remote working is not the total solution. But I think, Melissa, you touched on a couple of things. One is networking, right? We all came to this work environment with the networks we have. And while we've all strived for figuring out ways to have that network stay current and expanded, et cetera, both within government and across government and between government and contractors, there's no good virtual way to do that yet, right? There's really still no substitute for the kind of face-to-face. I go see a customer and she says, are you important to me? And I say, yes, I am. And she says, well, then why don't I see you more often, right? And Zoom is not going to make up for that. So I think we've got to figure out how to sustain that. And the second is not only recruitment, which may be able to work and may work better because you don't have to recruit people to live in the national capital region, right? But onboarding, integrating that workforce into your culture, bringing it into you. I mean, Melissa, you mentioned this. We've all learned from people who were older and wiser than us who were doing these jobs before we got there. It's going to be a lot harder to mentor. It's going to be a lot harder to integrate people into the culture of the workplace, which may be a good thing if there's part of that culture you want to get rid of, but not a good thing if there's some you want to sustain. And so I think those are all elements that we need to take into account as we look at workforce of the future going forward.
Excellent. Steve, thoughts about the workforce?
Again, looking out to the future, I think that, today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, the workforce in general is going to be more transitory. The digital world is going to make it possible for them to actually go to whatever particular role is the most interesting and most exciting for them. So tying the work to the mission and really making sure people understand the impact they're having is an absolute essential in order to retain the workforce. But at the same token, people are going to come in, they're going to try the profession, they're going to move on and go do something else. The recruiting side of this needs to work really well, and it needs to be efficient and timely as well. We know that the turnaround for getting hired at a government job has been a tough uphill challenge for years now. Made some progress, sometimes we regress. Private sector hires people in days. I see somebody that I think is really good and fits the job role and can grow with the business, I'll hire them in 24 hours. When can the government get to a point where they can do that? So, Dave mentioned the recruiting side of the business. It's absolutely important. And then obviously comparable compensation. It's no longer acceptable because to have lower compensation in the government because you get better retirements when you retire, it has to be competitive today. And so all of those things are going to be factors going forward in attracting and building the best workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. We're going to go into our final question now, and I'm going to start with Steve and then go to David and let Melissa take us home, as they say. And it's about advice to the audience. And so I'd like to give you each of you a chance to offer some parting advice to the audience about either trends or initiatives or opportunities that we must focus on in the year ahead, and so that we not only survive but thrive in the federal contracting business. And so we'll start with Steve, and then we'll go to David, and then we'll go to Melissa. Steve, what's some parting advice to the audience?
Well, we've covered some of this already. I do believe that the COVID pandemic we have will be behind us at some point, maybe a year, maybe two. That's all short term. We need to learn from what we're doing today and look at how to apply that in the future. So we do need to continue to push for the evolution of the profession. It's not going to change overnight. I mean, we have lots of ideas. The white paper covers a lot of ideas. And in the end, it's directional. It doesn't tell us where we're heading in terms of this is the perfect end result. But we need to continue to be persistent moving forward so that the acquisition workforce and the profession in general continue to increase the value to the government and all the citizens of the United States. Collaboration and best practices, especially sharing best practices across organizations. As I mentioned, DHS has a procurement innovation lab. Melissa's doing stuff in her organization. All of these are better, where we find unique, creative, and innovative ways of doing things to get through the procurement process faster. All of that needs to be shared across government. And I'm not sure how we do that and do that successfully. But all of those things around sharing best practices helps accelerate this evolution. And I'll leave you with this one thought. The government contracting profession today is responsible for the output and support of a workforce of approximately 11 million workers. That includes all the workers in the federal government and all the private sector contractors that are under contract to the government. Those 11 million workers are serving 331 million citizens and basically maintaining our global leadership. Government spending drives basically a significant amount of innovation in our economy. And while maybe the government isn't innovating or spending as much towards innovation as they have in the past, there's still a lot there. And we need to apply that same innovation to the acquisition profession. And I think that's what we're struggling with here, is now bringing what is a external innovation into the organization. And ultimately, I believe, will accelerate the government's ability to drive innovation globally in our economy and to do a better job serving our citizens. So let's continue the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. David, parting thoughts for the audience.
Well, thank you, Dave. And a couple of things. Number one, those of us who started our careers in the government and then moved to the private sector discovered that the procurement coin has two sides, and what looks to be one way inside the government looks very different when you're the bidder as opposed to the requirements generator. And so I think it's important for all the audience to recognize that and invest in understanding that. One of the things that we've done at PSC is to foster and promote and participate in reverse industry days. I think, Melissa, we did one of these with you, and it really helps the government side understand what the private sector side goes through in the process and what it looks like from backside. I think that the strength of the partnership depends on each side understanding what motivates the other. But at its core, that partnership between the government and the private sector, and Steve, your numbers of 11 million illustrate this. We are all in this because it's public service. We are all in this to deliver the results America needs from its government. And I think we start from that recognition and build on that to work the process. We're all going to benefit a lot, and so will not only all of America, but the entire world.
Excellent. Melissa, parting advice to the audience.
Well, it's hard to follow all of that. Really good discussion here this morning. I think, again, COVID, I think, has accelerated some things that really represent a silver lining to drive some real change that has been long needed within the acquisition system. And so I think, as others have said here this morning, we will get beyond this. COVID will be behind us someday. And so I think it's up to us to kind of figure out what are the pieces that we want to keep and build upon. It's really easy to kind of fall back into old ways. And so I think we have to be cognizant of that we don't just fall back into what's comfortable. And I would say that, we all know change is really, really hard. And it's easy to kind of fall back into the old ways because to tackle some of this really hard work, it takes a lot of energy, a lot of strategy, a lot of thought, a lot of, staying the course with it. And so I would just, ask our audience here today that to not give up, continue to try to drive some of the change that's needed. And again, I think the time is ripe with the data, the data capability, the data analytics capability, and the technological tools that we have at our disposal today. Now is the time to really take advantage of those things to really enable a better process, better outcomes for the American people. So stay the course. It's really hard. It's really easy to just kind of fall back to our comfort level and not want to take on the hard work because it's in addition to kind of your day job of keeping the engines running. It's also taking on that, driving that change. If nobody steps up to the plate to drive that change, we're going to be having the same conversation 5 years from now. So ask folks to kind of get involved and help us drive the change that we're all seeking.
Excellent. Melissa Starinsky is the president of NCMA. Steve Maier is the president of Management Concepts, and David Berteau is the president and CEO of PSC. Thank you all for your service to the nation. Thank you all for taking the time to be a part of this panel discussion. It was full of enlightening thoughts, and I know I am pumped up for the future. Let me also offer my thanks to all of our attendees. You are all toiling in the vineyard and the ones who are making the difference, and we have your back. So go forth and do great things. Thanks for spending the time with us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.